Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Created in the Image of God, the Role of Religion in Society. I'm your host, Wade Fransson, and I'm here once again with Emmy-nominated filmmaker Jafar Falahi and our new guest, Jacqueline Clare. We're shifting focus tonight, and we could not be happier to have Jacqueline on the presentation team. Jacqueline, I'll just share a couple of words about you, Jacqueline. Jacqueline is an artist who is breaking new ground through her artistic focus on spiritual realism. Jacqueline is an ideal candidate as a contributor to the mission of the Created in the Image of God show, as highlighted by this quote on the subscription page on her YouTube channel about spiritual realism. And I'll quote, "When we don't take the high road with our choices and therefore miss the opportunity to develop spiritual qualities, we are literally forfeiting the purpose of our lives." What better quote to add to the mission of Created in the Image of God with the sub-focus or subtext of the role of religion in society? So join us as we pivot now from having emphasized over the last X number of shows how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was issued in 1948 and agreed to by a large percentage of the nations on this planet, and how that fits into the divine plan, as illustrated by Matthew chapter 25, that when the Son of Man comes in his glory, he would separate the nations like a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And we have spent time clarifying that the verse is talking about national level. The parable is talking about actually separating the nations themselves. And of course, it applies to individuals and the people within those nations. But in our day, they're largely democracies. And those democracies are governed thus by the people who elect the leaders. And the whole nation is today being held accountable to the standards that in past societies were mostly targeting individuals through the holy writings that were issued by messengers from God. So we've tied that into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and explored that in depth, what some of them are. And then we shifted to the universal application of responsibility. And so as we make that shift, we wanted to also change the nature of the presenters on the show. So we're very pleased to have Jacqueline Clare here as the first regular contributor who is also female, who is a woman. And those of you who have been getting bored with Jafar, myself, and Daniel now have something much nicer to look at. Jacqueline, thank you so much for joining us. And would you mind just sharing a little bit about yourself, how you came to desire to develop a little bit of a public platform that you have been developing through your podcast and the readings that you've been doing online, and what that's been like for you and how the audience is reacting to what it is that you're presenting? I know that's a mouthful, but pick and choose from among any of those things.
Sure thing. Well, my pleasure. I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, so in addition to the artistic output that I have, I also have a podcast and a YouTube channel where I explore different issues from a Baha'i perspective. I have the Spiritual Conversation podcast, and then I have a couple of different series on YouTube where I'm actually just reading Baha'i text. And the goal is to have very little fluff from me, and that it's really just a live deepening process. And it's really fascinating to be here on the show with you, because my seed of inspiration for launching the YouTube was, a bunch of different factors coming together. But specifically, I watched an episode, I think, of the Rubin Report, and he had Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro on at the same time. So there was this pretty diverse, Abrahamic white men, but their religions are diverse, their lifestyles are diverse, these three different men. And they were talking about religion and society, and they were sort of like all wrestling with something. And I was just so electrified. And I felt like they need a really educated, versed Baha'i at the table, and they need a woman at the table. And at that time, could I have like teleported or something and been there with them? I didn't really feel like I could do justice to the Baha'i design for divine civilization at that time. But I decided to start taking my deepening on that very seriously. And I thought, well, I might as well make that process public and invite people to join me in that journey. And who knows who will stumble upon the content on YouTube. So that was the impetus for it, just taking my own deepening seriously, sharing it publicly so that it might help someone. And and then meanwhile, starting to like dissect different things going on in the world at the same time, my perspective informed by my deepening in the faith.
Thank you.
And
Oh, go ahead.
and I guess I should add, because you said just like, what has the response been and stuff? One thing is I find that it attracts really interesting people who resonate with different aspects of the deepening or some of my messaging, to the point that they want to contact me or join roundtable discussions like this. So that's been one of the best parts of it, is finding friends all over the world.
Wonderful. So I want to dig in a little bit to one aspect of what you raised. It's a topic near and dear to my heart, and that is the topic of diversity. And I love how you clarified when you mentioned, I think, the word diverse, and then clarified, well, it's certain identities, but nonetheless diverse in other ways. So one of the outputs from the work that I've been doing over the last several years is to establish a unity in diversity discussion group. And we hope to replicate this discussion group and open it up to more people to have the same experience. But we were very clear when we gave that title that we were not talking about diversity as seen through the eyes of identity or characteristics that people have in common that are independent of their viewpoints, right? Because you could have, let's just take typical, perspective differences. You could have conservative or progressive, conservative or liberal, however you want to use those terms, people who have the same identity characteristics. You could have white people who are conservative or progressive. You could have black people who are conservative or progressive. You could have men who are conservative or progressive. You could have women who are conservative or progressive, right? So the diversity that we are looking to is diversity of thought, diversity of perspective, diversity of opinion, diversity of even ideology. I'm not a fan of having an ideology. I think ideology is a constraint that is kind of dangerous. To adhere too rigidly to an ideology and not be open-minded. But different diverse ideologies at the same table, and try to get away from viewing diversity through the lens of color or orientation of other kinds, or even national identity or religious identity, because you could have you've got ultra Orthodox Jews and you've got very progressive liberal Jews, right? So tell us a little bit about that, because it sounds like you're maybe exploring some of those same thoughts in what you do, or maybe not so much. I don't know. What is your reaction to that?
Sure. Well, I think it's extremely pigeonholing to think that because of what people look like, that they should think a certain way, and to even make those assumptions is extremely revealing and unfortunate. So that was my first thought about what you said. I completely agree that what we're seeking is the beauty of diversity of thought, and your thoughts are informed by your existence. and all of those immutable characteristics and where you grew up and all of that, that informs your lived experience. And that's great. Now, what are your thoughts about these things? You know, like that's the important part. And I'm glad we're working towards that. And I look forward to a day when that is what we're valuing more than limiting people to what they look like and where they're from.
Another aspect thank you. Another aspect I'd like to bring up in this general context of introducing you to the show and having you welcomed to fully participate, as we were talking just before we went live, in the unfettered pursuit of truth, the unfettered search for truth, the search that is not constrained or bound, right? So let's talk about language for a moment. I come from a certain generation. I have a birth date, right? It is real. I can't. I've heard now that some people are wanting to officially legally change their age, in the same way that people are officially legally wanting to change other characteristics about themselves, right? But the fact is that I was born in a certain year and I grew up in a certain decade and so on. And that language was a certain way during that decade, right? And fast forward a decade or two or three or four, depending on how old people think I am, language in this current decade, the decade of 2020 and beyond, is very, very different, even in the United States, than the decade in which I went to elementary school or junior high or high school, or perhaps more importantly, college and university, right? I have a master's degree. I have a graduate degree. Even when I obtained that graduate degree, the language we used in academia was very different than the language being used today. And so that's also a characteristic that people bring to the table. So when we use terms that are outdated or antiquated, those terms sometimes come with baggage, and they could be viewed antagonistically or unfavorably by the hearer, right? And the user of that language would do well to update their language. But nonetheless, that's the language that they're familiar with. It's the language that they've been using and are comfortable with. And it's the language that they're likely to use in discussion inadvertently, and in some cases, unfortunately, right? That's another way in which people judge other people that they're talking to, right? The words that come out of their mouth. That should also perhaps be understood in that context. The reason I bring this up is even the way that we introduced you on the show and how happy we are to have a female perspective on the show. That language is even shifting, and that issue, or how we talk about that issue, and the words that one has to carefully select in talking about that issue, can raise concerns in the minds and hearts of some. So have you? We're different in terms of male and female, but also different perhaps in terms of age. And
Mm-hmm.
so, what are your thoughts on some of that as we begin to have this conversation and this dialogue and have it very publicly?
Sure. I think we can tiptoe around language and what is the new acceptable speak to the point that we never get to anything of substance. So I actually see it as a hindrance sometimes to seeking the truth. We can clarify when we need to, but I think we can waste a lot of time being touchy about, I might get offended when you say the word blue, or orange, because I had a bad experience one time,
Yeah.
so I was not offended by it. I'm glad, um, glad to be alive and glad to be here and fine with the way things
Yeah.
are. So, yeah.
Well, and that may be a good segue to bring up the last point that I want to bring up in this context, and that is, as we on this show are pursuing an unfettered pursuit of truth, right? We've raised topics The focus, the context is always created in the image of God. So we refer back to the holy writings. And I'm a former minister, so I am deeply versed in the old, what is known as the Old and New Testament, the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, you might say. Different ways of referring to those might also be problematic or offensive to some. And so that's always the go-to position of what we're talking about. And then applying that to the modern world, right? The role of religion in society. So that's always going to be the focus. And we want to discuss the truth. We want to raise different perspectives. We want to even tackle thorny topics. We want to go, as the proverb goes, where angels fear to tread. I am not afraid of putting my foot in my mouth. I'm not afraid of addressing a subject that some will cause some to squirm and feel uncomfortable in the pursuit of truth. But we will never on this show debate each other. We are not in a debate. The difference between a debate and a dialogue, in my opinion, is simply stated: in a debate, you're trying to prove the other person wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to prove yourself right by proving the other person wrong. We are not engaging in debate at all. We're very favorably inclined to the views of others. We're very tolerant and forgiving of the words that they might use to express themselves, the way in which they might accidentally say something that is unfortunate in a given context. Whereas in a debate, one would pounce on those words and go on the attack and use it to discredit the person and use all kinds of rhetorical tricks like ad hominem, right? Which is, just killing the messenger, right? Trying to destroy the reputation of the person speaking, trying to discredit them and toss them aside rather than valuing and listening to their perspective. So we try to be very loving in the conversations and the dialogue we have, and thus very forgiving as we raise these thorny topics. And in so doing, we can really listen to the person, their intent, what they're wanting to say, what they're trying to get at, and really allow that person to fully express themselves in this unfettered pursuit of truth. So nothing new to you, I know, but it bears saying for the audience as well, especially because tonight we're going to jump into a rather thorny topic. One of the reasons I've been looking forward to having you on the show is the title of this show, Created in the Image of God, implies something, because that phrase is taken from the book of Genesis. We've covered it on this show, but we've glossed over it. We've never addressed it. And tonight we're going to address it head on. Why? Because we're going to shift our focus from universal human rights, which is the minimum standard that we as people and as nations must have, the degree of tolerance and respect we must have for every human being, the degree of freedom. And we've talked a lot on the show about non-coercion, right? We are not advocating any form of coercion. In fact, my position is that religion has often been coercive in the past, and that this is a violation of actually the precepts that were intended with that religion. When, let's say, certain people end up in a majority and they're practicing a religion, they can then often seek to coerce other people to conform to their views and their beliefs. This is one reason America was founded as the Pilgrims, as the traditional story goes, which most Americans accepted until recently, that these Pilgrims were fleeing religious persecution and established a continent based on religious freedom, a big place of refuge where people could flee to have the free expression of their religious beliefs. And it was built into and enshrined in our Constitution. That's how we began to talk on the show about human rights, is we looked first at the Declaration of Independence and the unalienable rights, and then we segued into universal human rights at the United Nations. So we will never advocate for coercion, but that's a two-way street. So people who have certain religious beliefs, they also have religious freedom, and they should have the right to express their religious beliefs, to hold those beliefs and to express them. They should certainly not be forced to conform to somebody else's beliefs that might be construed as religious beliefs, even if they're not drawn from a religion or ideological beliefs, wherever they're being drawn from. Right? Many things are being claimed to be scientific today by people who engage in a form of scientism, right? Which is taking certain scientific discoveries or facts or even disputed topics and then turning them into an ideology or weaponizing them, politicizing them even. So, long-winded discussion about who and what we are for our audience, but why not do that when we have a new guest who's going to be joining us for a regular basis? So let me jump into this now. I am a former minister. I tend to be long-winded, but want to thoroughly cover these topics. So the title, Created in the Image of God, is taken from Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 27. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, birds of the air, the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on earth." I've talked extensively about how man was made sovereign on earth, given sovereignty. All things physical were put under the feet of the human beings. As far as the physical creation goes, we're at the top. We have sovereignty. That sovereignty was limited by the greater and lesser lights that were put in heaven, the sun and the moon. And it says to rule the day and to rule the night. And our purpose is to submit to the light. Our purpose is to retain that precarious position of sovereignty and dominion while submitting to the light. This is part and parcel with the whole purpose of humankind. And part of what that light reveals is the next phrase. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, unless one gets confused by that word him, male and female created he them. This premise is consistent throughout all the major religious traditions, that God created all things with a certain order and structure, which is conducive to his vision for his creation, especially humanity. This vision is then expressed through spiritual and moral teachings and reinforced with divine blessings and punishments that go along with the physical creation. There are laws within creation. You jump off a building without protection, you're going to, suffer the consequences of hitting that ground rather hard. That's, a very basic example of the laws of gravity, centrifugal force. But there are many much more subtle laws which are governed by the ordinances and the religious traditions. God also emphasizes the importance of submission to the light and conformity with the divine order and divine structure through prophetic promises and warnings. These are often an aggregate of outcomes or consequences for good behavior or bad behavior. We've also talked about Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 on this show that really illustrate how that plays out over time, that submission to God, obedience to his laws brings all kinds of happiness, and disobedience brings all kinds of misery, ultimately not just to the individual, but to society as a whole. So there are many areas of debate, discussion, and contention in the modern era, but none seem more potentially divisive than this basic one that is at the very core and foundation of our creation, created in the image of God, male and female. Well, we're at a point in society where this is really being challenged and contested and changed. And this is a very contentious topic. We're, again, say one more thing and then I want to open this up. I have to repeat it though. We're not intending to coerce or enforce, but rather to have the freedom to hold this belief and to share it and teach it to any others who are interested in sharing that belief, to have that freedom. So having said all that, I'm going to open it up. Jafar, you've been very quiet listening. Jacqueline, you're new to the show and may have some thoughts. on this topic of the title of the show, Created in the Image of God, and how that's playing out the role of religion in society today.
Jacqueline, did you want to say something?
No, I was actually looking forward to hearing from you. It's been a while.
Yeah, I don't quite know where to start. One thing that I was thinking is there's the idea of looking towards sort of material or identity factors in order to um, point to what people are doing. The focus on like superficial qualities of people, or the which word they say, or what the color of their skin, when engaging with another person, is I think Jacqueline alluded to it, is it's a limiting factor that keeps us from being able to explore higher ideas, right? So if when we're interacting with another person, we're focusing on which word they use, or what ideology they are. I guess that's one way you can interact with a person, which I think leads to what you're saying. It tends towards a sort of debate with the person, because you're identifying how you're different from that person in a superficial way. The other way to do it, which would be something closer to recognizing that the person is created in the image of God, and that we're all here for a higher purpose, would be to look for the good in that person, and try to steer yourself away from whatever potential uh, uh, darkness they have in them. So I think when it's happened, we all do it, but someone says something, and we think, well, wait, do they believe this terrible thing because they used this word? And then we can get obsessed with that, with this fear that maybe they're sexist, or maybe they're anti-Semite, or whatever it is. Or we can dig deeper and search further in their consciousness and see, find out the truth, and maybe they are racist or sexist. But you can still overlook those things and still look for the truth and the goodness in someone, even though they have problems. And I think that to me, the kind of situation that we're in right now in this country, where people are eager to criticize other people, lends itself towards a superficial form of relating to each other, where it's just about these this kind of, what's your slogan, or what's your identity. And I think that's something that, as a religious person, I don't want to be looked at that way, and I don't want to look at other people that way, even if they are good or bad, whatever it is. I want to look for the good in people. And I think that's like that's a general thing that I think everyone can agree is better than looking for reasons to criticize and debate people.
Thank you, Jafar. Jacqueline, were you having any thoughts on that you wanted to add?
I appreciated the thoughts and was in agreement with a lot of them, but nothing particular at this moment.
So I'd like to just add one more dimension to this, right? And that is that I don't think either of you have children, but I do, right? And my children are now in sixth and ninth grade. So I have a freshman in high school, a boy and a girl. And we had them in a private school, a Montessori school. We love the Montessori approach to education, very open, very emphasizes creativity. And the premise of the Montessori educational philosophy is that the child has an inherent desire to learn, and ways in which the child learns naturally through the development of their brain and body as they are growing up. And there's this kind of idea of follow the child, let the child pursue their own educational interests, and provide the means, the tools, the structure, and the assistance for that child's intellectual curiosity to find fruitful ground and to never squelch that desire to learn. Well, we moved recently. My daughter had completed the 8th grade. And so we moved and we had to look for school systems so that she could enter high school. There was no high school program in the Montessori. We took on out a little bit earlier, at the end of 5th grade because he's younger and we moved. So we couldn't keep busing him over to where we used to live. So they've now both entered public school. And they were, kind of sheltered from some of the debate and topics of what's going on in school because this issue of gender identity is one that is being discussed in the schools. And as a parent, it's being discussed in ways that, to my mind, are completely inappropriate and not suitable for those young minds. I don't feel it helpful for my child to question their gender before they've even had a chance to figure out who and what they are in a variety of ways or learn to adapt to their growing, changing bodies as they are, as they were created. Biologically, of course, there are in rare cases situations where this male female differentiation is not so complete, but those are relatively rare. And to have this discussion with entire classes and to force the children to go on record on paper on some of these topics about how they identify themselves is, I believe, creating all kinds of unhealthy circumstances that we've never had before. And of course, there are those who claim the exact opposite, that this is very healthy and that the previous situation that we had was unhealthy. My point being, discussion is needed on this at the adult level. And parents have a unique say, in my opinion, in this discussion. Many of us might be familiar with some of the debate and discussion going on in society, and we might explore some of that on a future show. I do want to show one clip where this was debated in Congress. This is not a new clip. It stems from July, and it's a brief exchange. It's only about just under 2 minutes. But I want to preface it with why I'm sharing this clip. And that is, speaking of education, we all know from Civics 101 that there are 3 branches of government, right? Executive branch, the judicial branch, and then there's the legislative branch, right? The legislative branch is Congress, 2 houses. You've got the Senate and then the House of Representatives. And the purpose of these branches of government is to create the laws, to legislate, right? The judicial branch then interprets the law and applies the law in life. And the executive branch is a little different, but the judicial and the legislative are, sort of yin and yang of that law creation process. And so from time to time in Congress, discussions are had on a number of topics. Now, the clip I'm playing, I don't know the full context of exactly how and why this discussion came up. Might be something that we look into to expand and unpack this a little bit further in a future show. But I wanted to show this one clip to illustrate the kind of exchange that is going on. And in my opinion, the kind of exchange we should perhaps not be having. And that there must be a better way. And when we're done with that, maybe we'll talk, when we're done playing the clip, maybe we'll talk about a better way to have this discussion. I'll go ahead and screen share this. It is Senator Josh Hawley and Kiara Bridges from July 13th, I believe it is. And apologize if I mispronounced either of their names. So, Jacqueline, Jafar, if for whatever reason the sound isn't coming through, let me know.
I want to visit with you, Ms. Maskey, but before I do, I just want to clear one thing up. Professor Bridges, you said several times, you've used a phrase, I want to make sure I understand what you mean by it. You've referred to people with a capacity for pregnancy. Would that be women?
many women, cis women, have the capacity for pregnancy. Many cis women do not have the capacity for pregnancy. There are also trans men who are capable of pregnancy, as well as non-binary people who are capable of pregnancy.
So this isn't really a women's rights issue.
We can recognize that this impacts women while also recognizing that it impacts other groups. Those things are not mutually exclusive, Senator Hawley.
Oh, so your view is that the core of this right then is about what?
So I want to recognize that your line of questioning is transphobic.
So I'm going to pause it there because I want to take this slowly and have discussion and sort of unpack what's going on live in the moment. The conversation shifted from the senator seeking to clarify, again, my perspective of watching this, seeking to clarify what exactly this professor is seeking to address. He asks, is it women's right or something else? What kind of rights? What exactly is she wanting to address? And her reaction is that his line of questioning is transphobic. And I guess what I would say is that in higher learning, right, in universities, you do have intellectual pursuits that seek to address complex issues and seek to frame them up and provide language, perhaps as a tool, and perhaps clarify certain what can we call them? Certain pathways of discussion that are productive or not productive. So the professor here is addressing this kind of topic in a way with which she is familiar, right? She's calling out that the senator's line of questioning could lead down a path that she views as very negative, even transphobic. But it completely shifts the dynamic of the discussion from one that might be called exploration. And maybe it can be said that the senator was somehow being antagonistic, but isn't it his job to clarify and ask probing questions of anyone who testifies in front of Congress, right? Jafar, Jacqueline, your thoughts on this?
Well, again, we don't know exactly the context of this discussion and so on and so forth. But I think this is pretty basic practice of critical theory where everything is a closed argument and your opponent is always wrong, and you can shapeshift and twist reality as much as you need to in order to ensure that your opponent is always wrong. So to me, that's what I see going on here, and it's it's very hard to break through it. In critical theory, whether she knows it or not, she's in academia. This is something that I think she's seeped in, and it's really quite impossible to have truth-seeking discussions when it is just a power struggle and you're just trying to revolve around certain points and not move the discussion, move the exploration, as you said, the search for truth any further. So I see it as very frustrating because I don't know how to move from this dance of I'm right and you're wrong, and that's just the way it is, and I'll keep making up things to back up my point. How we move from that to an actual honest search for truth together.
Yeah, and I'll add, she didn't label him. Her very specific wording did not label him as transphobic, right? Rather, your line of questioning is transphobic. So she's skilled in discussion so as to not make that mistake and accuse the person, right? Give the person, the ability to, I guess, back out of it, right? And say, oh, yes, you're right, I'm sorry, without themselves being labeled transphobic. But I think most people would recognize that it implies that you, sir, are transphobic, right? And it's just kind of an escalation of rhetoric, in my opinion. If I were on the other end of that, I might immediately become defensive if I were not equally skilled in this sort of, verbal fencing that is now going on. It is immediately becoming a battle and antagonistic, as you pointed out. Jafar, thoughts that you may have on this?
Well, I think, and that's the danger, is that when you do get into a sort of contentious debate like this, and maybe like Jacqueline's saying, or maybe you guys are implying that one side is almost baiting the other side to get upset, or is accusing indirectly the other side of being transphobic or racist. The temptation is then to get to get defensive, and say, well, I'm not racist, and then it escalates, and then it becomes, and then you kind of prove the person, the person gets angry, and then you kind of prove that they are this thing that you indirectly accuse them of. So I think it just goes back to this idea of debate and contention, is something that I'm just not interested in. It's not a form of exploration, it's a form of battle. And like, we want to explore reality, whether it's outer reality through science, or it's inner reality through religion. And I think that, man, it's a disaster when people start going down that rabbit hole.
Well, that's an excellent point. I'm thinking also in terms of my experience in negotiations. I've been in some really high level negotiations going way back to when I was, even before I was ordained into the ministry, I was doing work behind the Iron Curtain, negotiating with the Iron Curtain countries and their government controlled tourist agencies to bring religious observers into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and even Russia itself in a time when this was illegal, right? It was not legal to hold worship services. And yet we, as a denomination, conducted 8-day religious festivals with hundreds of observers through savvy negotiation with these countries who wanted the valuta, right? The Western currency, as the Soviet Union was beginning to collapse economically, and these countries were under incredible stress. They wanted that Western currency. And so we found a way to open those countries up to religious worship for the benefit of people within those countries. And we had to like ferry the people from Poland that wanted to worship with us had to go to Czechoslovakia. The people from Czechoslovakia, or East Germany had to go to Czechoslovakia, and the people from Czechoslovakia had to go to Poland. And that's why we were looking to open up Hungary and Russia itself, because that was one of the stipulations. We could not have anyone from within that country worship with us. So we would have to arrange visas with them. But a very high level negotiation. The point is that what I want to make here, that I've continued doing some negotiations for high stakes, large IT deals worth in excess of $100 million. There's often this aspect of obtaining the moral high ground, from which you can negotiate, from which you can position yourself, right? And this is something that traditionally religion has done, right? By asserting a high religious moral standard, you can claim the moral high ground. And this is, of course, a dangerous risk, because in a discussion, you want to pursue the truth, not gain leverage, not establish yourself as a superior person, right? There's a degree of spiritual arrogance, of moral arrogance that begins to be expressed. We establish ourselves as standing on moral high ground, and thus we establish ourselves as morally superior, right? The very thing that probably Ms. Bridges wants to fight against, right, is those who would establish moral high ground of superiority above certain other identities. And yet you can't fight fire with fire, right? You cannot commit the error or the sin yourself to solve the error or sin that you're trying to solve, right? So all of these subtle things are going on here. Let's see where this goes next.
And it opens up trans people to violence by not recognizing them.
Wow, you're saying that I'm opening up people to violence by asking whether or not women are the.
So having paused it for so long, we're having some buffering issues, but you see how Senator Hawley now takes it personally, naturally? Oh, you're saying I'm opening up people to violence by asking you this question. He calls her out on what she's implying. He doesn't let her get away with this subtle, your line of questioning is transphobic and it opens up people to violence. He doesn't go on the defensive. He goes on the offensive, you might say.
But what would, so like as
Yeah.
far as the role of religion, I think that like in the context of I don't know, Jacqueline, maybe you've had experiences along these lines. On I don't know if you interview people on your show or what the situation is. But when you're confronted with a situation like this, like what is the job of a Christian, say, or a Baha'i, or how do you deal with that so that it doesn't slide into a debate or contention? Because I've failed in the past with that miserably, and I don't know how to do it, to be honest with you. It's easy it's easy in some circumstances when you're detached, but when you're not detached, say it's with a family member or something like that, like you just get consumed in it. And if you're not good at debate, then you can burn bridges really easily. So that's one thing that I struggle with, especially as this country in particular becomes more polarized and contentious, and people are looking often to stoke fights to kind of poke you and get you riled up. So yeah, so I mean, Jacqueline, so have you had experiences with that, or do you deal with that on your show, or is it just like you're exploring? Is it more just exploring reality?
Well, both. I do interview people on my show, but I have yet to have a real clash of opinions where this situation would arise. It is extremely difficult. I feel like everyone's being a little bit too nice, though. I mean, I think that uh, I think we're dealing with like biblical levels of delusion. And I think it, like for this particular clip, for the number of trans men that do get pregnant, like what is that number? This is a very small number of people. And I don't think asking her about women is in any way an intentional assault on those like 12 people in the world or whatever it is she's talking about, like it's just it it's either a delusion or it's just very tactical. So anyway, I'm not going in the direction you guys want. I don't know how to, when you have those encounters with family members, maybe it's a little bit more reasonable than this, but when people are just spouting talking points and they have an agenda, it's very, very hard to have a discussion and to have a search for truth.
No, thank you. I appreciate that you are being a little more direct. I I can be very direct, and I tend to be too often. So I really work hard at expressing concern and compassion. I do agree with you, though. This is a serious risk to society, to our entire civilization, to force other people, to coerce other people to so change their language as to accept somebody else's reality, which in times past would have been called mental illness, right? In times past, gender dysphoria was clearly a mental illness. And today, many would say, and I don't disagree with them, that we are encouraging gender dysphoria in our schools. And if you look at the statistics of the rise of gender dysphoria, one could liken it to a pandemic. And one would have to ask, what is the cause of this pandemic? Where is this virus coming from? Because biologically, people are not changing. Science is holding out the hope, you might say, the false hope, I would say, or the delusion, I would say, that you can transition your gender. We may have somebody on the show who's actually interviewed some of those who went through this transitioning process and tried to come back from it. Um, we have knee replacements, we have heart transplants, we got liver transplants. It's not inconceivable that we could begin having womb transplants, right? So that men could become birthing persons through medical intervention, right? And that this could become widespread. So it may not be limited to very small numbers in the future, right? And there are some who are envisioning that kind of a future and paving the
But
way for that kind of future.
that's the part we have to be questioning, you know, like
Exactly.
that is the issue. See, I have tremendous compassion for anyone who is actually who has gender dysphoria, and like that would be terrible. I have bad enough days without feeling like I'm in the wrong body, you know, like that would be terrible, and I have great compassion. And somebody sent me a compilation today from the House, which I already kind of knew of, I just never read, where trans sex is permissible at this point. It's like kind of talk to your doctor policy. And if somebody legally changes their sex, like on their birth certificate and everything, they they can marry, like in if they're now female, they can marry a man. Um, and
But
so
there are I'm familiar with that, and there are severe restrictions as to how and when that can take place. Similarly
right.
to the issue of abortion, where the statement, the religious statement is that it's forbidden. That is the
Hmm.
word that's used, that it is forbidden. But the next word is except, right? It
Hmm.
is forbidden except. So when we look at the right of abortion having been rescinded at the Supreme Court level, it's an acknowledgement that no, there's not a universal right enshrined in the U.S. Constitution that guarantees every woman the right, under all circumstances, to have an abortion. Rather, there might be some circumstances where it would be legal, thus permissible, but there would be many circumstances where it is in fact forbidden, and where there would be punishment and penalties for having an abortion. And this is the debate, right? So I really appreciate you bringing those things up.
Well, I see we have a comment too, but I just want to finish that thought because I wasn't quite finished, and it's relevant
Sure.
that I go to the end of that thought with it. The problem is that we have these prophets of decadence, like Shoghi Effendi talked about. We have this incredible push, and you know there could be other factors like hormones and toxins in the food and that sort of thing. But really, I think we have a couple of generations that have absorbed way too much television growing up. And we have teachers in schools. My husband always points out that if some random person, like at the bus stop, started having these dialogues with children, they would probably be arrested for like sexual assault and pedophilia. But you have teachers sanctioned within schools having these discussions. It's like we've trapped them with the traumatizers, you know? So that is the problem. So that's why I preface it with saying I have great compassion for the rare instance where somebody is actually struggling with this. I think we have people like this woman in this clip who are just dogmatically, aggressively, I don't want to use that phrase. They're really forcing it on people. I was going to use one that would have been very bad in this context, but yeah.
Well, let's segue back and complete the clip and then come back and discuss it further. I think the buffering issues are now resolved with that I was having earlier. So hang on, let me just represent this.
is transphobic, and it opens up trans.
Well, we'll just wait it out with the buffering issues. I'm not sure if I'm still there. I see some glitches in addition to the video here. Just close that tab out and try to reboot it. Just give me a minute here. So let me share one more comment here. And Jet4231 says, if God created both man and woman in his image, that seems to tell us something about the term image of God. It seems to me that it indicates that it must not be anything physical. Thoughts on that while I try to get this video reloaded?
I think he's saying that the image is not something physical.
Yeah. Clearly, our puny little forms don't remotely do justice to who and what God is. I've viewed this for many decades as having to do with the capacity that we have as human beings. I think we talked about this last week, even, that we're given free will. We're given a limited sovereignty. We're given the right to choose, right? One of the first things that he did in the Garden of Eden was offer Adam and Eve a choice between two trees, and even warned them against choosing the one that they eventually chose. But he let them choose it anyway. And that choice has followed us throughout. We spent some time on that in the first few episodes of this show. So clearly those things are all much, much more important than the fact that we have a hand with 5 fingers, which we can use to manipulate things with. Let me go ahead now and try one more time to just let this video play through. We shall see. It could be that some other members of my family are upstairs using the bandwidth in other ways. But hopefully by rebooting it and starting over, we'll get it going.
I want to visit with you, Ms. Meskey, but before I do, I just want to clear one thing up. Professor Bridges, you
Oh no.
said several times, you've used a phrase, I want to make sure I understand what you mean by it. You've referred to people with a capacity for pregnancy. Would that be women?
Many women, cis women, have the capacity for pregnancy. Many cis women do not have the capacity for pregnancy. There are also trans men who are capable of pregnancy, as well as non-binary people who are capable of pregnancy.
So this isn't really a women's rights issue.
We can recognize that this impacts women while also recognizing that it impacts other groups. Those things are not mutually exclusive, Senator Hawley.
Oh, so your view is that the core of this right then is about what?
So I want to recognize that your line of questioning is transphobic, and it opens up trans people to violence by not recognizing them.
Wow, you're saying that I'm opening up people to violence by asking whether or not women are the folks who can have pregnancies?
So I want to note that 1 out of 5 transgender persons have attempted suicide. So I think it's important
Because of my line of questioning? So
because
we can't talk about it?
because denying that trans people exist and pretending not to know that they exist.
I'm
is
denying that trans
dangerous.
people exist by
Are
asking
you?
you if you're
Are
talking
you?
about women
Are you?
having pregnancies.
Do you believe that men can get pregnant?
No, I don't think women can
So
get
you are
pregnant.
denying that trans people exist?
And that leads to violence. Is this how you run your classroom? Are students allowed to question you, or are
Absolutely.
they also treated like this, where
No,
they're
they're
told
allowed
that
to
they're
question.
opening up people to violence?
We have a good
by
time in my
questioning.
class. You should join.
Oh, I bet.
You might learn a lot.
Wow, I would learn a lot. I've learned a lot
I
just in this
know.
exchange.
Absolutely.
Extraordinary.
I'm sorry, I just have to say it's so dishonest. It's so dishonest the way that conversation unfolded with him. And maybe, he was being a little cheeky or whatever, and she knew that and she was already ready for a fight. But if you had the lines on paper and it was just actors reading the lines, like he's just asking for clarification. And she immediately turns around and makes it about her pet issue and accuses him of being responsible for people's suicide, and let alone that it's a mental health issue and that's a very hard path that they're taking, that has something to do with why they are so unhappy. But like, just to accuse someone right off the bat when that's not what it sounded like to me at all, it's just so dishonest. So if we're talking about unfettered search for truth, it's just wildly dishonest.
So the the thing that strikes me is there's a reality, right? There's a reality, and there's an attempt to distort that reality, right? I believe God created us male and female, and I know in the Baha'i faith this is referred to as the two wings of a bird, right? And if you try to, the way I've looked at this, if you try to put the right wing of a bird on the left side of the bird, it won't fly, right? If you have two right wings, it won't fly, and two left wings, it won't fly. And so the intent, and this goes back to the holy writings. I know this is inherent in the Baha'i writings, also in the Bible, that the intent is be fruitful and multiply. The first commandment in the Bible is dress and keep the garden. That's the very first thing they were taught. So the Bible supports good stewardship of the planet, right? And to the degree that humans are, messing up anything in the ecosystem, we have a divine responsibility, and religion supports it. Even conservative Christianity supports it, because the very first commandment is dress and keep the garden. The second commandment is be fruitful and multiply, right? And God gave us the means to do that, which is male and female, right? And that's the only commandment that we've really pursued in an unfettered way, is that multiplication, right? That goes on unabated. But it's a foundational reality, and that is being distorted. So I view her responses as a very carefully guarded discussion, right? To your point, completely fettered, completely tied up in knots so that it can only deliver one outcome, because that premise is so full of holes. There are many loose threads on that sweater. If you allow any one of them to be pulled, the sweater unravels, right? So I agree with you that there is no search for truth. There's no search for balance. There's no search for adequately protecting the rights without forcing the entire world to conform to the individual needs or wants, desires of some of the population. And this gets back, we're now, finally coming around to the core shift, which is from universal human rights to personal individual responsibility and our collective responsibility, right? The need to preserve the rights of one person who is suffering from gender dysphoria or some other biological situation which makes them different, perhaps very different from others. The need to protect that person's rights and to provide them with a safe space and with safe spaces. Does one have to force everyone else to conform to something that is not real in order to protect the dysphoria, right? Do the loonies have to take over the asylum so that nobody is called out as having a mental health issue? You're on mute.
It was more of an aside. I was just saying, I guess so. I guess
so. So where and I shared too, as we were coming out of the discussions on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that there were certain sites devoted to the Declaration of Universal Responsibility. But those sites typically went to the level of society needing to enforce the human rights versus each individual needing to conform to certain minimum responsibilities as a human being, right? So to go along with those universal human rights that each of us have, there's also universal responsibilities that each of us has individually. And what should those be, right? That's something that I'd like to explore further on this show. Also getting back to your point, Jafar, about not knowing how to deal with these topics, not knowing how to address them when they come up.
Yeah, I think that it's a big struggle for a lot of people because they get confused and they're not. A lot of people aren't good at debate, and they get upset, and it causes a lot of conflict, which then legitimizes critical theory in showing that its opponents are angry and mad, and then that just fuels it. So people, that's why I feel that people need to understand what Christ taught, and how that plays out in like turn the other cheek, or whatever it might be. I don't know, so that you can navigate in the storm. Because if you don't understand what's happening, and if you're not in the eye of the storm and you're out in the wings of it, where the winds are over 100 miles an hour, you're not going to make it.
So I've just posted the link to the video in the chat if anyone wants to watch that again without buffering and interruption issues. And I hope you will, and I hope you'll continue to provide input and comments. We appreciate those who have commented tonight. The subscribe button is also there on the YouTube channel or the Facebook page where this is being streamed. Please do that. Share it with your friends. And join the discussion. Send us your comments, your input. I'd like to also announce tonight that we're going to try to do a good job of keeping this show to around an hour. We've gone way long in times past. We will still tend to maybe go over an hour to wrap up whatever discussion we're having. We're going to try to keep it to an hour. So this may be a good point to conclude for tonight. But Jacqueline, Jafar, any additional thoughts that you have on this topic or anything we've discussed tonight?
Well, I think that our intention to be tactful and to be sensitive to different views and be all of that stuff, the sort of soft, cautious approach, I think that that's good, and that's something that people like the woman in the clip are not using, right? They're very dogmatic in their view. But I think that we shouldn't overemphasize it. I think we've got that, and I think it's time to develop some of our other qualities and strengths to be sure that we are defending children and defending people who are perhaps getting swept up in this, and it is devastating for their lives. So it's just kind of like knowing your strengths and stuff, and knowing that the tack thing we seem to be doing very well, and we should also keep being brave warriors on that search for truth, and don't be afraid to crack a few eggshells.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Well stated. And show a comment here from Sabrina. Apologize, Sabrina, if I get your name wrong. Laumer. Avoid fellowship with the ungodly because they put out the light. Now, this is a concept that is inherent in all the religions, right? Have no fellowship with the ungodly. Now, that term is viewed as pejorative, right? Let's spend a couple of moments unpacking that in conclusion. Ungodly. What does that mean? Again, all the religions tell us to do it. How do we do it? Jesus said, I want you to be in the world, but not of the world. In the world, because if I told you to avoid all fellowship with the ungodly, you'd have to leave the world entirely. So we have to be in the world, and we have to participate in its affairs. I know I come from a place where it was against my religion to even vote, because Jesus said we were not citizens of this world. So literally against my religion to vote, and I never voted. When I later became a Baha'i, I literally got physically ill in a recent president election where I had to choose between two candidates. I won't say which one it was, because I felt that burden, that responsibility of it now was a sacred responsibility to actively participate, at least to the degree of voting. Whereas in the past, I had been able to comfort myself with, I don't have to participate in any of this, right? And I could avoid that. So we might look at those two words, fellowship and ungodly. What are your thoughts on those two words? I love etymology. I love diving into the meaning of words. There's a power in them. What are your thoughts?
They might be a little. I mean, to what degree are they subjective, and then to what degree can we make them objective? I would wonder that, but I feel like a lot of civilizations, a lot of cultures develop what is ungodly and who they want to have fellowship with kind of naturally, and they create an out group and an in group, and that kind of steers the culture in a positive, well, in a direction hopefully positive. And I think that kind of happens naturally without sort of legislation. But I guess in some cases, there, at what degree do you make it explicit or concrete as to what the in group and the out group is? But it definitely happens just through body language, oftentimes, and then who we invite and who we don't. I think that kind of goes into a little bit about what fellowship is. But and then there's the explicit, like what exactly is ungodly, and a lot of religions state that clearly, and it's enforced. But it goes beyond that to the degree where in your interpersonal relationships you just don't associate with certain people, not because not because anyone told you to, but just because you just kind of feel that way.
Well, quick comment to that, and then Jacqueline, if you have any thoughts. Again, this idea of coercion, right? So joining a religion in America and most Western societies is voluntary, right? So having common practices within your culture, when it is a voluntary choice to belong to that culture or subculture, is what this is, in my opinion, referring to. Legally, again, getting back to universal rights, the rights of all citizens in a secular entity, right? A government that has freedom of religion, but is not necessarily free from religion, allows those religions and those cultures to be self-selective. Um, and neither side gets to pejoratively label the other. So this this term ungodly would then, in my opinion, describe certain behaviors, right? Certain attitudes and approaches that one chooses not to associate with. We might say it's ungodly to be racist. And people would naturally choose not to be around people who are racist, especially if they were racist against you, right? Why would you want to be with people who revile you because of your skin color? Right? I've been in some uncomfortable situations as a white man in that context where some people of different color were very vocal about how much they hated white people. So I have experienced that to some minimal degree. And now, of course, there's going to be a hue and a cry about how I don't understand what is like on the other side of that color divide and how much worse it is. I'm just saying I can have a tiny bit of empathy because I've experienced it to some tiny degree. But religious this religious principle is self-selective, right? Um, and it describes certain behaviors that we would not wish, for example, our children to mirror and mimic, right? So we wouldn't want our children to be around, stealing, to be around illegal drugs, to be around cursing. I don't like my children to take God's name in vain. I don't like the phrase God, oh my God. And my children are asked to not use that phrase. And it's difficult and challenging for them because it's constantly coming out of the mouths of even others in our fellowship who don't have that same, I'll call it, awareness that we have and that I've been providing them. That is, one of the 10 commandments. Do not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. So that would, in our culture, count as a small sliver of ungodliness, is to be constantly saying, oh my God, every time something happens.
Those are all really good points. And I would agree that it's somewhat self-selecting. I think it's a really personal thing between the believer and God. But I think the principle is that bad behavior is contagious, and delusion is contagious, and conflict is contagious. So it's important to be selective about who you spend time with and stuff. Jed has something to say. Perhaps fellowship does not mean all connections with, perhaps discussions with the ungodly is okay, but fellowship may imply regular friendship and closeness and learning from. I think that's a great point. I mean, in a search for truth, there's a degree of voice that you want to give different people and different views, but not you don't have to entertain them if you feel that they resonate with you, or whether you're like heart centered or strictly rule or scripture centered, like whatever seems ungodly, you don't have to entertain it.
And Sabrina, for your additional comment, ungodly means to me those persons who do not seek truth and justice, but seem to be operating on some other foundation. Well put. Thank you.
Huh. I don't want to open it up more, but it reminds me a little bit about the idea that you've mentioned, Wade, where if you want to go far, go alone, and if you want to go, what was it?
If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Like you want to be, if you want to get somewhere meaningful, oftentimes you don't want to have to, you want to go with people who you agree with and who you have a lot in common with, so you can focus on the goal, so that you're not, so that you don't spend all your time arguing about what a man or a woman is, for instance, which, so you obviously you're not going to hang out with that person because you've got another agenda, so I think it's important to find people who are like you, and hopefully you're godly, and hopefully they are too, I guess. And then you can get somewhere.
Thank you. One last comment to what you were saying, Jacqueline. Find the pandemic, right? And not to in any way discuss the rightness or wrongness of how we did what we did and how society reacted, but mask wearing became a thing, right? Social distancing became a thing. And some degree of social distancing, some degree of mask wearing is necessary to avoid the virus or the viruses, the various diseases that are associated with ungodliness, right? I mentioned some of them, right? Disobedience to the basic laws of civilization, right? Those would be considered ungodly for sure. But there's an additional layer that I mentioned of, the statement, oh my God, which for many is, totally okay. And I would be viewed as some kind of religious nut for telling my kids, don't say, oh my God. But there's a certain degree of social distancing that immediately happens when my kids don't do that. And in order to help reinforce it, because it creeps in so easily, and that's why I liked what you said about it's infectious, right? Those behaviors are infectious. And so for, my son, for example, likes to play some games on a tablet with his friends. And that phrase is constantly, I mean, in a 5 minute period, the person on the other end of the conversation might say it 50 times as they're playing the game and being attacked and attacking in their role playing game. It's just like a constant stream of, oh my God, he did this. Oh my God, that. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And it's very hard for my son then not to respond in kind. And there's a consequence of losing screen time when it happens in order to reinforce it and protect from that infection. And this is true in so many areas. So to your point, why would we have it be, why would we hire instructors in school to expose them to things that we consider to be ungodly and enticing and infectious? And as parents, we might want to control that exposure, how and when we help them develop their spiritual immune system or their virtues based immune system to try to instill the healthy virtues, and the healthy practices, and only expose them in very limited doses to those negative things that are so infectious. Basic principles of child rearing that are tried and tested throughout millennia, literally. And a comment for our Baha'i friends: progressive revelation does not equate to progressive in all things. And the way that the term progressive is used in society is not necessarily what we might understand under the term progressive revelation.
Yes, but I also think it's a bit of that principle, if you want to go far, go together, because like I think it's very we're going to go to some advanced places by honoring and adhering to some laws and teachings that seem very traditional in certain ways.
Yeah, I think there are sometimes some who can get the vision and want to run out ahead. I'm almost venturing into a topic which I will avoid, so I won't go there tonight. That can be saved for a future episode. Jafar, Jacqueline, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Any last minute words of wisdom, comments, insights that might be useful for our next show together? Or Jacqueline, just your experience of being on the show for the first time. Anything you'd like to add, either of you, here as we conclude?
Just thank you for having me. It's been really interesting.
Yep. Good to have you, Jacqueline.
Thank you. Really grateful to you for venturing forth. You're a bold, courageous woman, and appreciate you so much. Thank you for joining us. And to our viewers, again, remember to like, subscribe, share. We hope to see you back next week, same time, same place, to continue this discussion.